Princess Lana shared her birthday with her loyal and devoted subjects. One year, she commanded the royal band to play all day in the market square, and the next year she sent her royal gardeners to plant a rose bush in every garden. The time came for her 11th birthday. This was to be the year of her betrothal, and it should have been a time for great rejoicing, but it wasn't. The trouble was that the king had arranged for his daughter to marry a very cold and haughty young prince, who was, however, very rich, and the princess didn't fancy him at all. But in spite of her private sorrow, the princess remembered her loyal and devoted subjects and sent her pages to give a toy to every child. All the girls had dolls, all the boys had hoops. The princess stood at the window and smiled as she heard their delighted cries as they received their gifts and began to play. That afternoon, while the preparations for her party were in progress, she slipped out into the palace garden to be alone with her thoughts. Suddenly she was startled by a shrill voice, and an old woman appeared from the shadow of a large oak tree. "And what of you, my pretty one?" said the old woman. "Are you not to have a doll, then, and you the birthday girl herself?" And she laughed shrilly. Nervously the princess stepped back, for the old woman was very ugly and dirty, and the princess had never met anyone like her before. "See, I have a gift for you," the old woman continued, and she thrust a small, grimy bundle into the princess's hands. "Care for it always, and it will bring you your heart's desire." Remembering her manners, the princess began to stammer her thanks, but the old woman disappeared as suddenly as she had come. Quickly she unwrapped the bundle, and was dismayed to find a small soldier doll, roughly carved from a piece of wood. The uniform was faded, and the painted face chipped and worn. "Well, you're a sad little doll, and no mistake," she said. "But you are not to blame for your condition. I will treasure you as I treasure all my birthday gifts, and you will bring me my heart's desire." But what is my heart's desire, I wonder? As she made her way back to the palace, she thought deeply, and suddenly she knew that what she most desired was to be free of the cold and haughty prince. She marched straight to her father and said, "Father, I do not love the cold and haughty prince you have chosen for me. I do not wish to marry him." The king nearly had a fit. It was quite unheard of for a princess to have any views on such a matter. He fell into a terrible rage. He shouted and roared until he was blue in the face, and he stamped his foot. He took off his crown and threw it onto the ground. He stormed up and down the room, waving his arms, and he kicked the royal dog, who came running in to see what all the noise was about. The royal dog was very put out and bit the king's ankle, which made his rage even more terrible. Finally, because the princess would not change her mind, he cancelled the party and locked her in her room. "You shall stay there until you change your mind," he told her, and there the matter rested. It rested there for a very long time. Years passed, and the princess would not change her mind. The prince grew tired of waiting and married someone else. The loyal and devoted subjects began to worry. The princess would soon be 15 years old, and that was the age for royal princesses to be married. They did not want her to marry the wrong man, but on the other hand, not to be married at all would be a great disgrace for the entire kingdom. It was a very difficult time for everyone. Princess Lana, meanwhile, had grown from a happy, lively girl into a sad and lonely young woman. She had no one to talk to except the little soldier doll, and he was her only comfort. Without him, her life would have been wretched indeed. One day, the king called all his people together and made the following announcement. "The Princess Lana is this day formally betrothed to King Boris of Euphalia. The wedding will take place 1 month from today." There was a great uproar at his words, and the princess began to weep bitterly. King Boris was a very old, fat, greedy, selfish, boring man, and the princess didn't fancy him either. But the king told her he would put up with no more of her nonsense. "2 guards will escort you to the church," he said, "and there will be no running away. My present to you will be a solid gold toast rack." The day of the wedding arrived, and it seemed that there was no hope for the poor princess. Sadly, she put on her wedding gown, which was of white lace with silver ribbon round the hem and small silver roses scattered over the bodice, and picked up the little soldier doll. "You have comforted me for many years," she said. "I cannot be without you today." The guards arrived and led her through the streets, which were full of silent people. There were no cheers, but a few boos for the guards, who looked very embarrassed, but were, after all, only doing their job. At last the princess stood beside King Boris, and it was at that moment that a very old, very ugly woman pushed her way to stand before them. "Show me the doll, princess," she commanded, and the young bride-to-be held out the soldier doll. The old woman touched it lightly, and it was immediately changed into a real soldier. She, too, was changed from an old woman into a beautiful fairy godmother with a fairy wand. The princess stared at the soldier, and he smiled. "I have no riches to offer you," he said, "but a loving heart. Will you come with me and be my bride?" Of course, no girl in her right mind would refuse such an offer, and in less time than it takes to tell, the fairy godmother waved her wand and a white horse appeared. The soldier sprang up onto its back and helped the Princess Lana to do the same, and before the king could collect his wits, they had gone. No one ever doubted that they lived happily ever after, but we can never be sure. You see, they were never seen again. This story about the dragon is a rather dreadful and bloodthirsty story. So if you don't like dreadful, bloodthirsty stories, you better not listen. When I say dreadful, I mean dreadful. The dragon lived in a cave just outside a small town, and he terrorized the townsfolk from morning till night. At regular intervals he would descend on the town, breathing smoke and flames, and roaring and lashing his long spiked tail and flapping his big green leather wings. He would set fire to a cottage or two, and would then seize 2 or 3 children and gobble them up. I told you it was going to be bloodthirsty. Occasionally, a very brave man would set out to slay the dragon, but none had succeeded. Always the dragon, who slept with one eye open, would see the glint of sunlight on the man's sword. One puff from his flaming nostrils would burn the poor fellow to a crisp, and his brave sword would be no more than a few drops of molten metal on the ground. In desperation, the mayor offered 100 pieces of gold to anyone who could rid the town of the dragon, but no one dared. The golden pieces lay for many years unclaimed in a small cloth bag in the mayor's parlour. Now, at about this time, a young soldier returned from the wars, and he chanced one day upon an old woman at a well. She was struggling to wind up the bucket, and gallantly he offered to help her, for he was a kindly soul. The handle was rusty, and the bucket heavy, but at last it drew level with the top of the well. The soldier was surprised to see that it contained not water, but a frothy blue liquid which bubbled and spat. The old woman lifted the bucket from its hook and stood it on the ground. Reaching forward, she took the sword from the young soldier and dipped it into the strange liquid. Then she held it aloft so that the blue drops ran down and covered the entire blade. "Now take it," commanded the witch. I expect you'd guessed. "And trust it with your life. It will not fail you." So saying, she disappeared. The soldier went on his way, pondering the strange event, and little realizing how soon he would be putting her words to the test. Before noon he came to the town where the really dreadful dragon had just eaten a horse and burnt down the mayor's house. As soon as the people saw that he was a soldier, they fell on their knees and begged him to rid them of the dragon. They told him of the 100 pieces of gold, which had just been rescued from the fire. Now, although he was a brave young man, a dragon was something he had not bargained for, but he agreed to try. He set off towards the dragon's cave, with the cheers of the townsfolk ringing in his ears. The dragon was lying outside his cave in the sunshine, fast asleep, with one eye open to catch the glint of sunlight on any approaching sword. But on this occasion he did not see a glint of sunlight. He did not even see a sword, for, unknown to the soldier, the old witch's magic had made the blade invisible to dragons. The dragon thought that the fellow approaching was unarmed and promptly returned to his dragon dreams. The soldier strode bravely forward and plunged his sword deep into the dragon's heart. It was such a shock for the dragon that he developed a nasty attack of hiccups. Hiccups is no joke if you are in the habit of breathing out smoke and fire and suddenly start breathing them in. Within seconds, the dragon burst into flames and was soon burnt to a very large crisp, and the young soldier was the hero of the hour. The town gave a great banquet in his honour. They had ham and cress rolls, and cheese and cucumber sandwiches, cut into triangles with the crusts cut off, and sausages, those little ones on sticks, and fruit salad and cream, and chocolate eclair, and pink and white meringues, and cheesecake, and sherry trifle, and ice cream, and lemonade, and Coca-Cola, and cider for the grown-ups. You can see that as banquets go, it was quite something. They wanted the young soldier to settle in the town, but he was homesick. With his trusty sword by his side and the bag of golden pieces clutched firmly in his hand, he went happily on his way. A giant moved into a cave just outside the little town of Casper. To everyone's dismay, he seemed to be settling in for a long stay. Now, some giants can be an asset. They are very strong and can do helpful things, such as lifting away trees that have been blown down onto the road, or holding up bridges that are about to collapse. Unfortunately, however, this giant, whose name was Bop, was the other kind of giant. He was a liability. That means he did unhelpful things such as knocking down houses and treading all over fields of barley with his big feet. So, of course, nobody liked Bob, and they wanted to get rid of him. "He snores so loudly, too," said one of the men. "The noise is like the rumble of thunder and wakes up my children night after night. And he's so dirty," said one of the ladies, wrinkling up her nose at the very thought of it. "He never washes and never combs his hair, and I've heard that his cave is a disgrace. We don't want him here." "And his clothes," said another lady. "That terrible old animal skin he wears is almost threadbare. And the songs he sings, they are not at all respectable. He is giving the town a bad name. We must send him away at once." So a petition was prepared. At the top of a long, long sheet of paper, they wrote the following words: "The people of the town of Casper wish to make it known that the giant Bop is no longer welcome to stay and should remove himself forthwith and as quickly as possible." Then everyone in the town signed it, and the list of names reached all the way to the bottom of the paper. It all took a very long time. While Bop was asleep, they crept up to his cave and left the petition outside, weighted down with a large stone so that it shouldn't blow away. Bob woke up next morning and was pleased to find so much paper handy. He screwed it up into little twists and lit his fire with it to heat the milk for his early morning cocoa. "Right then," said the mayor crossly. "We will have to picket his cave day and night. We'll have a rota." It was beginning to get quite exciting. The young men painted huge banners saying, "Giant, go home," and they took turns, 10 at a time, to march up and down outside Bop's cave. Sometimes, for a change, they sang "Why Are We Waiting?" and shook rattles and banged saucepans. Bob was very interested by it all. He couldn't read, so he didn't know what the banners were about. He didn't know why they were waiting, so he couldn't tell them. But he was flattered by their attention and began to feel really at home, which wasn't the idea at all. His snores grew louder and his songs less respectable, and still he didn't wash or comb his hair. The townspeople were beginning to feel decidedly gloomy about the whole business. "Right then," said the mayor again, "we will have to send in the army." Someone reminded him that they didn't have an army. "Then we'll get one," he said, and they began at once. 20 brave men and true were recruited, and training began. The men learned how to salute and how to polish their boots. They dug a great many trenches, and every morning they folded their sheets and blankets into neat squares. They learned a very jolly marching song and went home on leave and came back again. They did everything that an army is supposed to do. But before they learned how to fight, Bob slipped on the mountain one day and broke his leg. It took 17 pounds of plaster of Paris and half a mile of bandage to set the broken bone, and of course he had to stay in hospital. They had to empty one of the wards to make room for him, and he had to sleep on the floor. But he was very brave about it, and the people began to feel sorry for him. The nurses washed him and combed his hair. Some of the ladies in the town made him a pair of giant trousers and a giant shirt. Even more ladies set to and cleaned up his cave. They threw out all the rubbish, swept it clean, washed up the pots and pans, and put fresh flowers on the flat rock that Bob used for a table. Not to be outdone, the men dug over a piece of ground outside the cave and turned it into a garden. They planted neat rows of lettuce and beetroot, and at the entrance of the cave they planted a large pink rambler rose. When at last Bob came out of hospital in his new shirt and trousers and saw his cave, he was quite overcome. Everyone cheered, and there was a lot of merrymaking. The townspeople went to bed that night happy that Bob was now a respectable citizen, and that all their worries were over. But left to himself, Bob began to have terrible doubts. His cave looked so empty without all the rubbish, and the new shirt and trousers felt stiff and uncomfortable. He tried to sing one of his favourite songs, but it didn't sound right. So he took off his new clothes and put on his comfortable old animal skin. Then he mussed up his hair and tiptoed quietly out of the cave, through the town and away. When the townspeople woke up next morning, they were dismayed to find that their unwanted giant had finally gone. Once upon a time there was this terribly plain princess. I won't beat about the bush, she was terribly plain. All the visitors at the royal christening remarked upon it. "How extraordinarily plain she is," said our aunt, as she handed over a solid silver spoon as a christening present. "Quite exceptionally so," said her cousin once removed, as she put a solid gold napkin ring into the princess's tiny hands. I say tiny hands, but her hands were a great deal larger than those of most royal princesses. Her mouth was wider, too, and her nose was hopelessly snubbed. She also had 23 freckles over her nose and cheeks. The king and queen watched anxiously as the pile of presents grew higher, and the comments on the princess's plainness grew franker. Finally, the Lord High Chamberlain presented the child with a portrait of himself, wearing his full robes of office. "We shall be hard put to find her a husband," he said, gloomily, shaking his head with the worry of it all. The poor queen could bear it no longer. She burst into tears and sobbed all over the king's best ermine cloak, which did it no good. The princess, whose name was Sophia, lived on an island with her mother, good Queen Matilda, and her father, good King Ferdinand. The island was the Island of Two, and was one of a group of islands with original names like the Island of One and the Island of Three. Farther over to the right was the Island of Four, but nobody talked about that one. It was uninhabited and a bit of an eyesore, with trees and wild flowers all over the place, and no street lighting. All the islands were surrounded by seas of an incredible blue, and a golden sun shone all the time. The terribly plain princess thrived in this beautiful kingdom. But any hopes that she might grow out of her plainness faded with the passing of the years. She didn't look like a princess, and she didn't behave like one. Sometimes her royal cousins from 3 and 1 would come over to visit. They would play very genteel games like The Farmer's in His Royal Den and Here We Go Gathering Royal Nuts in May. But the Princess Sophia was bored by it all. She would slip away to find Bert, the gardener's boy. He was her one and only true best friend in all the world, or so she told him. Bert was also terribly plain. He had a snub nose, large hands, a wide mouth, and 28 freckles. He worked very hard because the gardener was bone idle and spent most of his time sleeping in a wheelbarrow in the shade of a royal pear tree. Bert trimmed the hedges and weeded the paths and raked the leaves off the grass. When Bert wasn't working in the gardens, he was busy with his secret plan to grow a giant blue marigold. He confided this secret to no one but the Princess Sophia, and the cook, and most of his relations, and he came from a very large family. The princess loved to help him, and together they mixed powders to sprinkle and solutions to spray. They grew a giant orange marigold and some small blue marigolds, but never a giant blue one. It was very disappointing for Bert, but he was a sunny sort of boy, and he refused to give up hope. When the terribly plain princess was 15, good King Ferdinand sent for the Lord High Chamberlain. "Look here," he said, "what are you doing about finding a husband for the Princess Sophia?" The Lord High Chamberlain bowed low. "Everything is in hand, Your Majesty," he said proudly. "I think I may say in all modesty, and without fear of contradiction, though I say it myself, as shouldn't." "Oh, get on with it, man," said the king. It was rather unkingly of him, but his nerves were frayed by sleepless nights spent worrying about his daughter's future. The Lord High Chamberlain tried again. "Bearing in mind the Princess Sophia's terrible plainness of face and largeness of hands, I have now discovered the ideal husband for your daughter." The king sighed. "I suppose he, too, is terribly plain," he said. "On the contrary, Your Majesty, Prince Archibald is of royal and noble countenance." The king began to feel much happier. "And where does this prince live?" he asked. "On the island of 8, said the Lord High Chamberlain. The king lowered his voice to a whisper. "And what is it that makes the prince an ideal husband for the Princess Sophia?" he asked. The Lord High Chamberlain lowered his voice also. "Your Majesty," he said, "the Prince Archibald is terribly short-sighted, in a royal sort of way. I doubt if he will notice that his bride is terribly plain." Good King Ferdinand was delighted. He told good Queen Matilda, who was delighted, and together they told the Princess Sophia, who was horrified. "But I don't want to marry him," she protested, and she stamped her foot and looked plainer than ever. "I want to marry Bert, the gardener's boy, and help him to grow a giant blue marigold." "But dearest child," said her mother, "the gardener's boy is terribly plain, and Prince Archibald is of royal and noble countenance." "Royal and noble poppycock," said the princess. "I want to marry Bert." But her protestations went unheeded, and the date was set for the wedding. You may well be wondering what Bert had to say about all this. The fact is that he didn't say anything, because he had designed a square parasol to shelter the marigolds from the sun's rays at midday, and was trying to decide the best position for it. On the island of 8, Prince Archibald was not looking forward to his coming betrothal, because he was a confirmed bookworm. His rooms in the palace had books where books should be, and books where books shouldn't be. Scattered among the books were various pairs of spectacles to help him with his reading. There were times when his parents worried about him. The day of the royal wedding dawned bright and clear. The royal party set sail from the island of 8 in the good ship 80, bound for the island of 2. The Princess Sophia waited on the quayside with good King Ferdinand and good Queen Matilda and the Lord High Chamberlain and hundreds of lesser mortals. The terribly plain princess wore a beautiful gown of white and gold lace and a rather thick veil. As the prince's ship drew alongside the quay, a great cheer went up from the princess's supporters, and the prince put down his book and went up on deck. It was a proud moment for the people of 2 when the Prince Archibald, of royal and noble countenance, prepared to meet the terribly plain Princess Sophia. But it was not to be. It so happened that the Prince Archibald had forgotten to take off his reading spectacles and put on his walking-about spectacles. Instead of stepping onto the ship's gangplank, he missed it by a good few inches and stepped straight into the incredibly blue sea. Now, although the people of Two were nice, well-mannered people, it isn't every day you can see a royal prince plopping into the water like that. I have to admit that they all fell about laughing. Some of them laughed so much that they fell into the water as well. Poor Prince Archibald was very upset. As soon as he was fished out of the water, he gave orders to sail back to 8 and turn to the next chapter in his book. The terribly plain Princess Sophia was also upset. She ran away to find Bert and weep on his shoulder. But when she did find him, he was at the top of a step-ladder, adjusting the square parasol over his precious marigold plants. The princess fell to her knees on the grass below him and wept terribly plain tears all over the marigold. When Bert came down 5 minutes later to see what was going on, he could hardly believe his eyes. The marigolds were beginning to grow. The plants grew taller and produced giant buds which burst into bloom. Yes, you've guessed it. Bright blue marigolds. That's almost the end of the story. Bert was awarded a medal, the Gardener's Silver Cross, and he was allowed to marry the princess. They went to live on the island of 4, where they raised many new and wonderful plants with the help of Princess Sophia's terribly plain tears. She could cry to order by thinking how nearly she had married Prince Archibald.